started. All right, we got more happenings going on. Now we get to go to Antioch. I hope everyone's groups were scintillating. Always scintillating. And you know, I've been waiting to use it. You know, I saw it. I thought this is a really good word. Just to see if you're listening, you know. Okay, so we got a great little section to look at tonight and to review, make sure we're all on the same page. And I want to highlight a couple of things. Primarily, we get to see the church really start to grow and gain some liftoff. Not just, you know, in the center of where God has been working, you know, for several thousand years. Now we get to go to Antioch, which is very exciting. A little context, it's a really big city, so in and around the area, around the Mediterranean. It's not quite as big as Rome and Alexandria, but it comes right behind them in terms of population and influence and wealth and sort of activity. It's really close, it's pretty close to the sea, about 17 miles away. This is just a neat little depiction showing, it's a pretty robust city. It's right along a river. It's in a very fertile area, and there's some, differing opinions on how big it was. That's why I give you a pretty big range of 200 to 600,000, which is a large. You're like, well, it could be a million, you know. Initially, I saw Josephus. He's going to come up a couple times. He's a Jewish historian. He cited it at 200,000, but then some other Roman guy said 600,000. So maybe he's just biased for that city. I don't know. But this is important because as we've been following the last several chapters of Christian persecution, somewhat ironically and miraculously leads to the church's growth and expansion, right? And it forces Christians to leave, and then they find more people that want to hear about God. Now, what's great about this story is that we get to see Barnabas come into focus. And he is one pretty prominent figure within the early life of the church, but it also is something of a very tangible and accessible story that hopefully we can relate to even today. Because if you just think about it, it mentions, two guys who kind of know a little bit of stuff, but they don't know everything, and so they sort of call for help, so to speak. Barnabas hears, hey, there's some Christians, let me go check it out. We have something similar happen just in our own day if you think about how a new church gets planted, where there's some group of believers that are interested in Christianity, and then sometimes they need someone else to come in and provide some oversight and some help. And this is sort of analogous to how our diocesan sort of structure works. Coincidentally, not so coincidentally, about 15 or 20 years ago or so, there was a group of Christians that had sort of heard about Anglicanism in Waco, a few families, and thought, man, this sounds kind of neat, but there was no Anglican church for them to go to. So one of the dads, how the story's been told to me, was just Googling Anglican church in Texas and found the Diocese of Fort Worth and just called them on the phone and said, hey, we'd like to learn more, what do we do? And this is how Christ Church Waco came to be, where Father Bob spent a little bit of time recently. And what was remarkable that we have a structure in place where they talk to Bishop Eicher, who's effectively filling the same role as Barnabas. And Bishop Eicher said, man, this is great. And they met and talked a little bit, and then he sent, I believe, Father Chris Culpepper and Mark Pauley, some names that might be familiar, to go down. And they started going down once or twice a month and met for Bible studies and confirmation classes and did celebrated the Eucharist for them, and that sort of got them going. And now they're a full-blown parish doing really, really well. And that's effectively what is happening here with Barnabas, who is entrusted with sort of keeping up of the Christian faith and making sure that anyone that either has an interest or a question about it can find the answer and know what is within the boundaries of Christianity. Which sometimes is pretty easy, sometimes not so easy too. At the time, there's all this debate, particularly in Antioch, although the conversation is different because the population is quite a bit different than Jerusalem, right? Which is part of why we cite, come up with this term Christian to refer to this sort of like new-ish group that is separate from the Gentiles and separate from the Jews as this new sort of entity. And Barnabas fills this role really, really well, fortunately. But this is sort of a precursor to what a bishop does literally today. Because Barnabas is a bishop. Even if they're not using the same term, that's what he is. And all the bishops to follow for the last 2,000 years, and if you look on that on that plaque, if you will, over on the far left, just all the way almost to the corner, has a line of succession all the way from Jesus and the first apostles down to Bishop Reed. Hand to forehead, so to speak, or head to hand, hand to head, I guess. Yeah, I'm getting confirmation. It's hard to phrase that. Head, hand, foot, I don't know, one of those. Okay, so it grows. We made reference to that. Although it is interesting just to think about it for a moment that even though Jerusalem you would think is sort of, the absolute center and heart of our own faith, effectively, although the actual heart of our faith is Jesus. It's just a little interesting to note that it didn't originate in Jerusalem. They had something else sort of that was a little bit more prominent in their identity, that of course being their Jewish heritage and history, which makes some sense. Okay, then we get to, it's always nice that every couple of chapters we have a really creative name of a person. I know last week we had Dorcas, and this week we get Agabus, which is just delightful. I don't know the etymology, but, it brings a smile. So, we see her, or he or she, sort of sending up and saying, hey, there's going to be a famine. What's fun is that we have, several other historical accounts that confirm that there was a famine around this time. Within, a few years, there's plenty of confirmation for that. We know it happened. And then we see sort of the disciples and the earliest Christians live into what they had settled upon several chapters before about sort of breaking bread together and sharing with one another freely. And we get to see that on full display. Now this also, there's two things to note. We see this mention of the word elder here. And this is the first time that elder here refers to, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, to a leader of a Christian or Messianic community. It gets used throughout Luke's gospel plenty of times, but it's referring to Jewish leaders or elders. Previously, this is the first time it gets used in referring to, it's the same presbyteroi word, but this is the first time it gets used for Christian elders, or priests as we would refer to them now. Now, one of the things that's great to see about this, we see this early Christian community very sincerely answer the call of the gospel to serve others, and they answer right away. The text almost blows by, it goes by so quickly within 2 or 3 verses that they say, okay, great, let's send them some help. But it also is an indicator of this group wasn't just, a small group of, 5 or 10, that there was some size, some means, a very healthy and active group. Now, if I were to hazard a guess of a number, I have no idea. There's no way of knowing, unfortunately, but we can, read between the lines that it was rather prolific already. And this is happening very, very quickly, which is great. Okay. Then we jump to Herod Agrippa, which, I don't know, for me just kind of sounds like because it has a little like extra name with it, it sounds like Jabba the Hutt or something. It's not the same number of syllables, but that's what came to my mind, so I had to share it. Of note, the way the text reads, he sort of bookends all of chapter 12, or most of it, right? Want to be clear, this isn't the same guy that we read about trying to kill, Jesus and all the other newborn boys way back in Matthew 2. This is his grandson. Herod the Great is Herod Agrippa's grandfather. Herod the Great, not a super fun, cheery guy. There's a little mention of him killing Herod Agrippa's own father when he was 3, which is kind of savage. For context, Herod Agrippa, he's born in 10 BC, and he spent some time within the Roman family, gets pretty close. Then, for some reason, some creditors try to chase after him. He gets thrown in jail for a little bit. In the end, this is what really matters, Emperor Caligula, another guy you can read all about, kind of likes him and gives him this territory to look over, which effectively is all the same territory that Herod the Great looked over before, sort of northern Palestine. Now, what's interesting about him, and as we see him, what Acts 12 sort of briefly describes, how he's interacting with the Jews there, that he's sort of easy and kind of quick to please, right? When he kills James, it mentions that, their response was good, and he liked that feedback, right? But we know also from some other supporting histories is that he kind of liked to play both sides, because he's in this sort of particular role, because he's, kind of distanced from Rome itself, and yet he's in this, heavily Jewish population, and he sees the benefit of working with both sides, maybe not equally, but trying to kind of play both sides, so to speak. So there's mention of him sort of observing and playing nice to Jewish festivals and sacrifices, even if he's not, sincerely believing them, but he sort of goes along with them. When he's in Rome, he acts like any other Roman official too. There's a little story of Emperor Caligula wanting, his statue everywhere, which all emperors wanted to do, which sounds kind of fun. And of note, Herod Agrippa sees that this would not be a good idea. He knows that would really upset the Jews, and so he's able to sort of run some interference with the Roman emperor and keep him from putting in a statue of himself in the Jewish temple. Obviously, that would be, not well received, right? So that's a little bit about him. Now, that was, before Christians kind of came onto the scene. He was able to kind of have a happy sort of status quo. But the Christians are viewed as this sort of disruptive, sort of third party. And obviously that is not desirable for him, and so he sets about arresting them. He kills James, and then we get to his arrest of Peter. Now, one of the things that I thought, as I was reflecting on it today, which was interesting, just how much of a stark contrast there is between this Roman official and Pontius Pilate, who, no less than 3 or 4 times, tries to not kill Jesus, but the Jews, are rather adamant. We were just reading it in the Tuesday morning Bible study, so it's fresh on the mind, right? I just think the contrast is interesting and regrettable. Now, the really critical thing about the sequence with Peter's arrest is that it happens around the Feast of Passover. And one, this has practical implications, but also some really cool symbolism behind it too. So, this is a famous painting of Peter in chains. And, my funny impression of it is that James is a little groggy. Not James. Peter is a little groggy. And the angel is trying to say, hey, let's get going. Put your shoes on, wake up. And Peter's not really sure. Even the text kind of describes him not being really sure if it's a vision or a dream or reality. But luckily, the angel was very patient and leads him into safety. Now, I mentioned that this happened at Passover, and one of the cool sort of analogies, or what we sometimes reference as similar to typology, which I think we talked a little bit about last week, is seeing just how certain things in the Old Testament kind of line up with something else in the New Testament, right? And in a similar way, how were the Hebrews, taken out of a similar type of captivity, slavery, happens by deliverance of an angel of the Lord. And it happens at Passover. Obviously, that was the first Passover, way back in Exodus. But this happens the same time, just several thousand years later. Both people imprisoned or held captive by some wicked sort of imperial figure, so to speak. I think was worth seeing. Now, there's one other cool analogy too that matches up really nicely between Exodus and Acts, which is how both people, aka the Hebrews in Exodus, and then Peter are told to get ready quickly, which is kind of interesting. It matches up very, very similarly. From Exodus 12:11, this is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste, it is the Lord's Passover. And Peter, by the way of the angel, is told to dress yourself, put on your sandals, and bids to wrap your cloak around you and follow me. Similar kind of urgency, which I think is interesting. Now, the other difference in this sort of moment, because this obviously isn't the first time Peter is sort of has a little great escape moment, so to speak. If you remember back in chapter 5, he goes right back. The angel tells him to go right back to the temple, and he keeps talking about Jesus, right? And this moment, he doesn't, which you could read as something interesting, why this time did he leave, right? And not the other time. Very practically, it's all in the text, because in the first sequence in chapter 5, the angel tells him to go back, and here there's not that instruction, there's not that direction. St. John Chrysostom notably comes out of the church in Antioch several hundred years later, has this particular quote reflecting on this passage. Noting this, while we always trust in God, as Peter surely rested peacefully that night while in prison, now to stay without such orders, to stay there in Jerusalem, would have been so rashly to expose himself and in a manner tempting God. This is kind of similar to the idea that I'm sure we've all heard that story of a person who's staying at his house and there's some, hurricane that's going to come through, and he's like, I'm going to stay here, I know God's going to save me, right? And then someone comes by in the truck and say, hey, get in, we need to go to safety. And he's like, no, God's going to save me. And then the flood is coming up, and he's sitting on the flood, and then a rescue helicopter comes in. He's like, hey, come on, let's go. And he's like, no, God's going to save me. And then he drowns, and he gets up to heaven, and he's like, God, where were you? He's like, well, I sent the man in the truck, I sent the helicopter. What more could you have wanted, right? So there's a certain extent where, while we do trust in God and His provision, to sort of knowingly go into certain danger could be potentially foolhardy and not wise, right? And as John Chrysostom notes, in a manner tempting God to so blindly and foolishly say no, I'll be okay. I don't need to risk that, or I will risk it. Could be foolish too. Got just a little bit ahead of myself. If you remember, there's that moment where he makes his way to the brethren, and the young woman is standing at the door, is so excited to see him that she closes the door back on him and then tells him, which is just pure comedy, right? To see you can just imagine people man, I've had this night, I've been walking with an angel, why am I sitting here now? Why can the angel come back and help me get through the door that's locked on me? What's notable about it that he says very plainly, go and tell James and the brothers. And that's pretty much the extent of his direction. And one of the inferences is that, yes, he names specifically James, but by extension he's saying, go and tell the rest of the Christian community. Because James at this time, he's the head. He's the bishop in Jerusalem. And so even though he's just naming James, he's saying go and tell the rest of the Christian community too, which is worth noting. And we're bookending with, we had at the front end a very angry Herod, and now we get to see his demise, which is kind of interesting. Because it's described that he has some fancy robe on that's like made out of silver and very shiny. And apparently some of the people are like singing some praises and call him to be like a god. Now, this is a retelling of that, sort of a commentary, if you will, from Josephus, one of these great historians, that has some rather colorful language about it. And it draws out one or two things that I think are important. Okay. And presently his flatterers cried out, one from one place, another from another, though not for his good, little foreshadowing, that he was a god. And they added, be thou merciful to us, for although we have hitherto reverenced thee only as a man, yet we shall henceforth own thee as superior to mortal nature. Upon this the king did neither rebuke them nor reject their impious flattery. A severe pain also arose in his belly, began in the most violent manner, and when he had been quite worn out by the pain in his belly for 5 days, he departed this life. Rather a little gruesome, although you almost expect for his belly to burst out or something, when it says a severe pain. That's what I have in my own mind from, what's that one horror movie? That's one. Thank you. There's always something. So, just backing up from just chapter 2, if you remember when Cornelius meets Peter and is singing some praises to him, and Peter very quickly sort of deflects and says, no, I'm just a man. We see sort of juxtapose this king guy who's loving being compared to a god, and we see what happens when one willingly accepts that. It's sort of this ominous smiting, if you will. There's another brief little story back in the second book of Maccabees, which is in the Apocrypha, of this king, who similarly is, loving being called a king and being compared to one of the gods. And this is a far more colorful description of his own demise. The body of this impious man swarmed with worms, and while he was still alive in hideous torments, his flesh rotted off, so that the entire army was sickened by the stench of his corruption. Pretty gruesome. But goes kind of hand in hand with what happens to our buddy Herod, or not so buddy. And you might have this impression of anyone that sort of willingly claims to be a god or godlike figure is at risk of the real God saying, no, you're not, right? And so there's this quote, this is just from a commentary book saying this: those who dare to raise their hand against God's people face divine punishment. And so we see that on full display. Thus ends Herod's own life. Then we conclude with what? Where the gospel continued to grow and multiply, or the word of God greatly increased, which is a sort of a somewhat common refrain at a few particular checkpoints within the narrative, that we see God's remarkable provision over the growth and spread of his church. And you just want to say, good job, guys. Let's see what happens next. That's all I have for that. Any immediate thoughts or questions? Great. All right. Very good. Great. All right. All right, let's stand. We'll have a prayer. You can stick around for just a second till I'll move the table.